If democracy is about fairly representing the views of the people, then we are failing with first past the post. As a country, we pride ourselves on our strong commitment to democracy, and yet the vast majority of votes cast basically stack up and simply don't make an impact on the overall result. In June's general election, no fewer than 68% of votes cast were effectively wasted. They made no difference at all to the actual outcome. And so I take part in this debate with a vested interest, yes. 1 million people voted Green in 2015, and under a proportional system that could have given us over 20 MPs. Those votes would have translated into people elected to fight for Green politics. But I also say it because I'm deeply worried about what our outdated, dysfunctional electoral system is doing to the legitimacy of our governance system. A system that is not only failing the political parties and failing to deliver effective government, it's failing the citizens of this country. 33% of people don't think that voting for their preferred party will make a difference. 44% don't feel that the UK Parliament is capable of understanding and effectively representing their concerns. Now, that is a tragedy. And I have to say as well, it's also a bit of an irony. We may well be on the path to leaving the EU, but all those who were promised that they would be given back control simply will not have it without meaningful electoral reform. So PR would not just bring some much-needed fairness, it would go some considerable way towards tackling some of the reasons that people don't bother voting at all. And in these times of voter volatility and diversity, I think electoral reform would be a system worthy of the name democracy. The current unrepresentative voting system is doing long-term pervasive damage. It manifests itself in phenomena such as a widespread lack of trust and faith in public servants, the growth of what some have coined with Orwellian overtones post-truth politics. Far too many of our constituents are disillusioned, disaffected and disengaged, and continuing to deny them a voice in their decisions that affect us all only perpetuates that problem. And yet that is exactly what is happening under first past the post. A system where votes are not all equal, because unless you live in one of a small number of heavily targeted marginal seats, your vote, quite simply, doesn't count. I will.
Well, lady from Brighton Pavilion, an example of how that is not the case, because 20 years ago, her own seat, her party got less than 3% of the vote in, and now they, in the most recent general election, got 50%. So large vote sheets, large amounts of votes can be moved in a relatively small amount of time.
Well, he'll forgive me if I don't agree that that felt like a relatively short amount of time. It felt like a very long time. And as I've said, 1 million votes in 2015 would have given the Greens over 20 MPs. You know, that is the bottom line here. So, yes, occasionally you can find a way of trying to buck the system, but that does not give confidence to our constituents up and down the country who simply want to know that their votes count. It doesn't seem a lot to ask. And I think it's quite interesting that it's been estimated that between 20 and 30% of people in this last election voted tactically. In other words, they are trying to fix the system themselves to the best that they can, but essentially, you know, they shouldn't have to try to game the system. What we should do is change the system. I will.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. My constituency, which was marginal in 2015, I was returned with a larger majority this time, but the truth is I was going door to door asking Liberal Democrat voters to lend me their vote. And in fact, there was no Green candidate at the general election because they recognised that splitting the vote might allow a Conservative in. And I was very grateful to the Green Party locally for making that choice, which has delivered a more progressive outcome.
Well, I thank him for his contribution and what he said about the Green Party. I do think that my Green colleagues were incredibly brave in making those selfless decisions for the better good of the country rather than for tribal political self-interest. Now, the Electoral Reform Society described the 2015 general election as the most disproportionate in electoral history, with a government elected on just 24% of the eligible vote. They further report that in the election just gone, over 22 million votes, as I say, 68%, were essentially wasted because first past the post takes no account of votes for the winning candidate over and above what they needed to win, or indeed for the losing candidate's votes. In 5 constituencies, 90% of the votes made no difference to the outcome because they were cast for candidates that didn't win or cast for the winning candidate over and above what they needed to win. Over 90% of votes. That is a huge number. And I'd also argue that first past the post doesn't deliver the best governance. I will.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for giving way. And would she agree with me that democracy should be about outcomes? And my honourable friend, the member for Exeter, talked about a fairer and just electoral system. Would she agree with me that a fairer and just electoral system would be more likely to deliver a fairer and just society where the forces of progress actually trump the forces of reaction? And in my view, there is a majority for progressive politics in this country, but that is being frustrated by the first past the post system.
Well, I absolutely agree with what he's just said, what the honourable member has just said, and indeed he preempts a little bit more of what I'm about to say. I was making the point just before that intervention about how first past the post doesn't deliver the best in governance, exactly as the honourable member was describing. And I say that from the perspective of someone who has been a member of the European Parliament, obviously elections to the European Parliament being by a system of PR, where collaboration and working cross-party is normal. It is encouraged, it is welcomed, people do it on the basis that no one single party has a monopoly on wisdom. A winner-takes-all approach to elections promotes adversarial politics. It sees each of the major parties seek to unequivocally defeat the opposition and negate the need for any cooperation post-election, and essentially not to take any real account of what voters wanted when they cast those votes. It also means that policy is likely to change quite dramatically when governments change, with greater extremes and greater impacts on economic and environmental policy, for example, and on social justice and inclusion. And there is research out there that finds that countries with PR systems outperform those with first past the post when it comes to issues that require a longer-term view and policy continuity. And obviously a key candidate for that in policy terms is the environment. And it is the case that countries with proportional systems, for example, score significantly higher on Yale University's Environmental Performance Index. I want to quote the former Labour MP and Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, because he observed that electoral reform isn't just about functional outcomes. That's been something we've talked about a lot this afternoon. But it's also about values. And PR is one way in which we can express our commitment to fairness, to openness, and to equality in our society. I also want to make the case that I think that under PR, we would be more likely to encourage more people to get out there and vote. It's very hard to persuade people to vote when they live in so-called safe seats and they know that their vote isn't going to make a significant difference. And again, there's evidence out there that suggests that those countries that do have PR see a higher turnout than those countries with first past the post. I think we'd also improve the chances of electing a parliament that better reflects modern Britain, because one of the consequences of safe seats is that it's harder for different groups to actually get themselves in the position of being able to win those seats. We know that still only 32% of MPs are women, 208 compared with 191 in 2015, yet that's still shockingly bad. Women MPs are still outnumbered 2-to-1 by male MPs, and the UK is now just about 40th in the world when it comes to women's parliamentary representation. People of colour, disabled people, carers, LGBT people are still underrepresented in Parliament. And I think that PR would make a difference to that, because under PR, MPs can't just rely on the votes of their tribe. To win the support of the majority of voters, they are forced to reach out across the party divide to the wider electorate, to women, to BME communities, and so on. And hopefully that means that those traditionally excluded groups end up standing for election with a better chance of being elected too. Now, in my final words, I want to just say a few things about tactics. The Right Honourable Member for Exeter rightly said that getting PR into the Labour Party manifesto is vital. He will not be surprised that I don't necessarily agree with his tactic for achieving that, but I certainly agree that we need to put pressure on the Labour Party leadership. And I am disappointed that we haven't had a greater commitment to PR and voting reform from the Labour Party leadership as of yet. Perhaps this evening we will hear a change of mind, because we know that there are over 200, or at least there were over 200 parliamentary candidates before the election for Labour who backed PR, as well as a huge 76% of Labour voters, and indeed many Labour MPs in this room today who've made incredibly powerful speeches. But what I want to say to the Labour leadership is this, that it is selfish to continue championing a voting system just because it has traditionally handed you power. It is immoral when millions of people are disenfranchised as a result. I would argue that no party can honestly claim to be for the many when they deny the many a meaningful vote. And Robin Cook, I apologise, Robin Cook understood all this when back in 2005 he said, and I quote, "Our objective, our slogan, should be to achieve an electoral system which puts our democracy in the hands of the many voters, not the few voters who happen to be key in marginal seats."
Yeah.